Well, hello to all of my methodical researchers out there. This is a little video about forms. Enjoy. So, what is a form? Well, that's pretty easy. A form is essentially a pre-made or partially pre-made legal document. The idea is that the attorney will find the right form for their situation, whether it's a contract or a complaint or whatever, and then they'll fill out the form, and then they'll directly use that form in some way in their legal practice. And that direct use makes the legal form quite unlike the other sources that we've looked at in this course, which have all been either primary sources like statutes or cases, or secondary sources that are basically kind of an analysis of those aforementioned primary sources. Instead, the form, as it relates to those primary legal materials, it's really hardly a source at all. Instead, it's almost wholly functional. A form is really meant to be used first and foremost. And because of that, it does make it just a little bit of a weird fit for the legal research process as we've discussed it throughout this course. But, they're just so useful, I feel that we need to touch upon it. Now, I hear you say, that sounds pretty practical, Professor. Well, I'm going to have to agree with you there. Indeed, if you imagine all of the sources that you will use when doing legal research on a vast continuum, stretching out from the most mundane and practical all the way to the most scholarly abstractions you can find in a law review article, forms are going to occupy just about the most practical spot on that spectrum. They are just very useful. They are meant to be used. However, although they do make things easier, forms obviously don't do all of the work for you. You'll definitely learn how to better find and use forms as you gain experience doing legal research and practicing law, but I want to go ahead and try to give you just a basic familiarity with this video. So when should you try to use a form? When should you try to find a form? Well, sooner than you think. Even though the end result of your legal research process is usually where the actual use of the form comes in, where you'll actually complete, the legal form for the contract or, the motion or whatever it is, you should really try to avoid that situation where you wait until the end of the process to find the form that you might want to use. Really, you should probably start to think about the forms that you might need during your preliminary analysis. And I would say that is especially true if you can find a really high-quality form, if the form includes its own annotations, its own analysis, because with those features, the form is almost like functioning much like your other secondary sources that you use during preliminary analysis, and you'll really want to try to use it alongside your treatises, alongside your legal encyclopedias and your ALRs and other secondary sources. Now, we can divide the universe of legal forms into two broad categories: pleadings and instruments. Pleadings are going to include all of your litigation-related documents. This is stuff like sample complaints, sample interrogatories, sample motions, even sample briefs. Anything you would use in court while pursuing a lawsuit, basically. On the other hand, instruments are essentially forms that function as templates for contracts and other contract-like documents that are meant to have their own legal effect. Think like wills and things like that as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, forms do not do the work for you. You're still going to need to do a lot of legal analysis to discern when you might need a form, what type of form you might need, and to evaluate the different forms that you might come across in your search for a form. And no form that you find is going to be perfect, trust me. You're often going to need to change things to make it a better fit for your situation, a better fit for your purpose. And even if it is a good fit, even if that form really works for you, even if you don't need to change that much, you at least want to make sure that you've made that decision based on your legal judgment and not just pure expediency, right? And not to mention just the legal work, the legal analysis involved in filling out the form. What information is appropriate and responsive? How should it be phrased? How does it advance the goals of your client? These are all things that you want to think about when you're using a form. But even more than that, a form is always going to supplement your other legal research. When you're drafting a contract or a complaint, you still need to have the legal judgment to determine what legal issues might arise, and you still need to have those fundamental research skills to find the primary sources that will help you evaluate and assess that issue. Those legal research skills that we've been discussing throughout this course. Forms simply just aren't meant to replace any of that. So that should give you an idea of how you might use legal forms, and also, what they're meant to accomplish, what they're not meant to do. But how would you actually go about finding a legal form? Well, it's not hard to find a legal form, but it can be really tricky to find the best form. There are just so many forms out there. It's crazy. It's madness. And, you'll find some really spectacular forms that are written so clearly and crafted very carefully to have some real flexibility so you can use that form in a way that will fit your particular issue or situation. But you'll also find other forms, just tons of legal forms that are much more basic. And these basic forms, they might be useful, but you have to be more cautious about using them. And you have to know that you'll most likely have to modify those more basic forms extensively so they can fit your situation better. And of course, to do that, you're going to need to know enough about your own legal situation and the various issues that are involved to know what you're going to need to modify. Now, your number one go-to source for forms is probably going to be the in-house collection at your law firm or your legal office if you have that available. These are pretty commonplace, and they're usually going to include forms that cover most of the basic activities that the firm or office is involved in. Now, they are also going to be a particularly good source because you know that the forms that you can find in this in-house collection are going to be styled in a way that has worked for your firm in the past. You also know that your supervisor is probably familiar with these forms. Another advantage is that other folks that you work with have used these forms from your firm's collection, and that's going to allow you to easily find examples of completed forms, and you might even be able to ask someone nearby that you work with who might be able to answer a question about such and such contractual provision and when they include it, why they include it, how they implement it in their completed forms. Institutional knowledge is something that you just never want to overlook. Now, aside from these institutional collections, which are really kind of their own thing, right? My favorite sources for legal forms are Westlaw's Practical Law and Lexis Practice Advisor. I'll show you, how these sources look and kind of basically how they work in just a minute. But really, their names are pretty descriptive. They are legal sources designed to give you just really practical advice, and they're going to be especially helpful for finding practical sources like checklists, like legal forms. The forms that they have are really just a notch above anything else that you can find. And they're superior because they contain tons of analysis, lots of helpful annotations that allow you to really ensure that you understand the law and that you're using the form as effectively as possible. These sources also have what they call smart forms, and that basically just means that the process for filling out the form is partly automated, and that does streamline things a bit with these long and complex forms. Now, the next place you're going to want to look for a legal form is going to be a treatise. Now, your more practical treatises are usually going to have some collection of associated forms. You'll usually either find them at the end of each chapter or section. a bunch of forms relating to the content of that chapter or section, or else maybe you'll find all of the treatise's forms like in their own appendix. And these are just going to vary in quality quite a bit because, well, we know that treatises themselves vary in quality quite a bit. If you find a good treatise, chances are it's going to have really good forms. But the big advantage that you get here is that not only do you have the form, but you also have the analysis in the treatise itself to give you context for the form, context for how it might best be used. And the other big advantage with finding forms through treatises is just plain old efficiency. Who can argue with that? You're probably going to want to look in the treatise anyway, right? So you might as well see which helpful forms it might have to offer while you're there. Finally, you can find forms in sources that simply aggregate forms. These include Westlaw's Form Finder, which just collects forms from a really wide variety of sources, including some of those aforementioned treatises. And there are also plenty of legal form books on Westlaw and Lexis, and in print as well. Some are going to be more specialized than others, but these form books are basically going to collect various forms for lawyers to use. They're not usually going to include that much commentary, and they really do vary just a ton in quality, so just be careful when you're using these. Okay, so let's take a quick look at some legal forms, so you can at least have just a basic idea of what I'm talking about here. First, we'll check out Practical Law on Westlaw. Now, if you have access to this in your legal practice when you go on to practice law after law school, it is an excellent resource that you should really explore further. You should also know that Lexis does have a similar product called Lexis Practice Advisor. Much of the functionality is going to be analogous to what I'm going to show you here. Now, navigating to Practical Law is super easy. You can either click this link here on the front page, or you can just go to the Westlaw logo, and it opens up this drop-down menu where you can choose Practical Law. So, yeah, the basic idea behind Practical Law is that it's organized in a really functional way. It's going to be structured around tasks and goals instead of by traditional legal issues. It's also going to generally just be way more oriented than Westlaw proper towards transactional or compliance-focused legal practice. And in these types of practices, you're more often going to be giving your client prospective advice about some future deal or contemplated transaction instead of advising them on litigation, which is just inherently more backwards looking. Still, you should know it's really just not even meant to replace Westlaw. It's better thought of as a tool to supplement legal research with more traditional sources. And the front page that we see here for Practical Law, it really doesn't look all that different from what we see on just regular old Westlaw, although just from our topic list here of different practice areas, we can see that it's just a little more focused on transactional stuff, transactional areas. And we can also see that our resource types are just pretty different. We don't have any, traditional primary sources like cases or statutes here. We don't even have any, just regular treatises that we would see on standard Westlaw. So let's just try to find a commercial lease, let's say for a shopping center tenant. Obviously, one way to find it would be to go to our real estate practice area. And then we'll choose commercial leasing. Pretty straightforward so far. And when we do that, it kind of just gives us this big long list of all this different stuff. And these practice note overviews that we see here are really a resource type to look out for, especially. They're designed, as you might expect from that title, to give you an overview or a summary of a task or a legal issue or kind of a discrete legal area maybe, but all from a very practical perspective. And just, from the titles that we see, you can get a real idea of this more functional approach used by practical law. As you can see here, we have, a few practice notes on key considerations for terminating commercial leases in these different jurisdictions. And that's the type of prospective transactional issue that you're not going to find a case or a statute that's just going to come out and address that directly. So I would really encourage you to spend some more time with this source, especially if you want to explore these more transactional types of legal practices. This is a really common type of legal practice for all lawyers, and they don't get enough coverage in law school, which just tends to be more litigation oriented. But for now, let's just go ahead and try to find that form, that commercial lease for a shopping center tenant. To do that, we will go ahead and narrow our jurisdiction to Georgia. And then we'll run a search for shopping center lease and see if we have any luck with that. Oh, looks like I need to narrow my jurisdiction again. I guess it resets it when I search for some reason. Why do you do that, practical law? It's not cool. Okay, great. And this results list, I think, looks pretty good for our small little search here. And our first result really looks like the type of thing that we want. In our description, it calls it a short form retail lease agreement for use in a small shopping center or strip mall in Georgia. Perfect. And we can also note that our title here specifically tells us that this is a pro-landlord lease. And that really is the thing that I just love about practical law. It's just so straightforward about things like that. And when we actually pull it up, we can scroll down and look through it and see that, yeah, this is a commercial lease, with all of the different fields that we need to fill out in here. They're all going to be in brackets for us. And if we decided to use this, it would be pretty easy. We would just want to download it or open it in Word and, start to fill it out. But it would really behoove us to check out all of the stuff that this form has to offer instead of just going straight to trying to fill it out. And really, these drafting notes that you see are what sets these forms from practical law apart from the other forms that you're going to run into. And they're just so well done. They contain lots of good information. And this introductory note is really pretty typical. It tells us first just about, the basic features of the lease that we're looking at. And then it goes on to, give us a nice little overview of the law of leases in Georgia. It even includes some references to primary sources that we would probably want to consult. And then as we scroll past that, we can see that we get drafting notes like that for basically, each section of the lease, telling us, why this section is important, maybe telling us what our different options are, telling us why it's drafted the way it is, telling us, legal issues that might come up related to that section. And it really walks you through the analysis, and going through this form early in your legal research process is really going to help you to spot legal issues that you can go ahead and advise your client on. And that can help you add a lot of value. Now, just as an example, we'll scroll down. Look at this drafting note on percentage rent. Now, percentage rent, it tells us, is very common in retail leases like this. It tells us why, the incentive for that percentage rent. But it also tells us that under Georgia law, liquor stores cannot enter into a lease where they would pay this percentage rent. And that is potentially a really important issue, that it's just served right up for you without you needing to do much heavy lifting or additional research. And it's something that, you may not have been aware of at all. And you definitely wouldn't have wanted that to catch you off guard if you were drafting a commercial lease like this. And if you scroll down past the actual form itself, I call it a short form, but it's got a long. Scroll past all this stuff and just see how many drafting notes are there. This related content is pretty helpful as well. We have our overall topics first, and then we have a practice note overview, like I mentioned earlier, just to give us that overview of the law on this area and of our practical considerations related to this area. And then we've got other practice notes on sort of other discrete related issues. And these are often going to be quite helpful for us. We would probably want to look at, this practice note here on the key provisions of retail leases, giving us some analysis and context on that. And, maybe this one on insurance as well in these types of transactions. And it even gives us some additional forms that really might be helpful for an attorney advising a client in this situation. I think just looking at this, looking at those drafting notes that we checked out, you can see just the incredible utility of practical law, especially for forms like these. But not all forms are created equal, and to sort of demonstrate that and show you sort of the spectrum of different forms that you might find, let's take a quick look at a similar form through just Westlaw's standard form finder. And this is basically a tool that aggregates various forms that are just found throughout the different sources on Westlaw. A lot of them are going to be from various treatises and form books and other secondary sources. And to get to it is pretty straightforward. We just choose forms from the front page here. And we'll go ahead and select Georgia. And then we'll just search for shopping center lease. Okay, and for some reason, even though we search Georgia forms, it still wants to give us lots of national sources. So apparently we need to put another filter to get only Georgia stuff. What gives, Westlaw? Didn't I tell you I wanted to filter it before I ran that search? Now, these results can sometimes be a little difficult for us to navigate because they include, lots of these sources that are organized by clause. If you wanted to, instead of just starting with a single form, kind of a la carte, choose just a bunch of different lease clauses and create your own, sort of version of a commercial lease like this. And also just our titles aren't necessarily going to be super descriptive because they're going to be the titles that are in the context of this form book or of this treatise. But if we do scroll down a little bit, we do see this form. And if we just look over the description, it does seem pretty close to what we're looking for. And we can see that this is indeed a shopping center lease agreement. It sounds pretty close to what we want. and it is from a source called Georgia Landlord and Tenant Lease Forms and Clauses. This is a form book, and if we go to our handy table of contents here, and this is going to be the table of contents from the form book, from where this form originates, you can see that we do have an explanation here. We can navigate to that, and we do get this very short explanation for this lease, definitely not nearly as extensive as what we saw with the form on practical law. And, it does look like this is a really pro-landlord form as well, and that's helpful to know. But what I want to know is where are all these pro-tenant leases at? Come on, people. But yeah, if we look over the form itself, go back to that form, you can see that, yeah, we do have a commercial lease. It's very thrilling reading material, I tell you. And if you wanted to use this form, if you wanted to fill it out, you could just download it using this easy edit version here. But one thing we just don't see here are really anything like those drafting notes from practical law. There's just nothing in here that would tell me about, that prohibition in Georgia against percentage rent for liquor stores, for example. And there's nothing really that refers me to, helpful related materials or forms. We've basically just got the form itself. And it's certainly, a very usable form, but we'll have to put quite a bit of work in it to use this form effectively. And even more work on top of that to really give our client the most effective advice possible. With either option, whether you choose Form Finder and find this type of form, or you use practical law and find the form that we looked at over there, you're going to have to do some more traditional legal research to explore those issues more fully. But with this form, because we don't have that additional content there, we essentially have to start from square one. I mean, we have the form. We don't have to start from the beginning and draft every provision. But when we're talking about researching these potential legal issues where your added value of it as an attorney is really going to come in, it doesn't really give you that much to work with here. Well, those are legal forms. Chances are when you are a practicing lawyer after law school, you're going to grow really accustomed to finding and using these just in a variety of contexts. And as I've tried to emphasize, most of the hard work is really about using your own legal judgment to spot potential legal issues with the lease or the complaint or whatever the form it is, and then using your finely owned legal research skills to find the sources that you need to evaluate and assess those issues. And this is, of course, going to be so much easier if you can find a high-quality form. The gold standard here is really practical law, but the form itself is mainly just a convenience. It's not going to replace your legal research skills or your analysis. It's just going to supplement them and make turning out that end product a little bit easier. Okay, that's all I have for now. Until next time.